Good evening and welcome. My name is Tria Raimondo and I'm the Director of Global Development Programs at the Council. I'm pleased to welcome you tonight to hear from Mona Eltahawy on the 7 necessary sins for women and girls. This program is part of the Women, Equity, and Global Development Forum, which engages and convenes diverse global perspectives and advocates for inclusive, sustainable, and equitable global development practices. Thank you to our sponsors for your support of this series, lead sponsors Blue Cross Blue Shield of Illinois and Horizon Therapeutics, and our patron sponsors, the Frankel Family Foundation, Whole Foods Trust, Ashley and Avery McCall, Susan and Bob Morrison, and the Zakat Foundation of America. A quick reminder that tonight's program is on the record and we are live streaming. The Council is an independent and nonpartisan platform. Views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. We welcome your social media engagement, but please take a second to silence your phones. We'll be taking questions from the audience as well as through our online survey application, so please type ccga.live into your browser and select today's program. Following the program this evening, you're welcome to join us for the November edition of Cocktails and Conversations with Council Young Professionals at the St. Jane Hotel, which is just across the street. Please see our YP ambassadors who are at the back of the room if you're interested. Now, I'm delighted to welcome back to the Council Mona Eltahawy. She's an award-winning author, activist, commentator, and thought leader on global feminism. Her first book, Headscarves and Hymens, led international discussion on women in Islam. Her most recent book, The 7 Necessary Sins for Women and Girls, has once again catalyzed a discussion on embracing power and fighting oppression. It will be for sale and signing following this evening's program through the bookseller just to my left. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Mona Eltahawy. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Mona Eltahawy, and this is my declaration of faith. Fuck the patriarchy. Whenever I stand at a podium or give a lecture, I begin with that declaration of faith. Whether I'm speaking on a panel on feminism in front of an audience of 1,000 in Lahore, Pakistan, or a summit for activists and politicians working to end violence against women and children in Dublin, Ireland, or on a stage as part of an evening of multi-generational African feminists in Johannesburg, South Africa, or at a lunch for medical students in New York City, USA, my declaration never changes. I could say, dismantle the patriarchy, or smash the patriarchy, or use any number of verbs that signal urgency, but I don't. I'm a writer, and I understand how language works. I understand how audiences and readers react to the language I use. I know exactly what I'm doing, and I say, fuck the patriarchy, because I'm a woman of color, a Muslim woman, and I'm not supposed to say fuck. In my experience, almost nothing can match the power of profanity delivered by a woman at a podium unapologetically. Because how many women, not to mention women of color or Muslim women or working class women or, are ever even invited to the podium? And of those, how many, when they get on stage, still speak as if they're asking for permission to speak? I have lost count of the number of times that I've heard women on a panel preface every contribution as if our right to speak is an imposition, as if our contribution is a burden, as if our thoughts are secondary or tertiary, even to the discussion at hand. How many times do you hear a woman dismiss or diminish her right to comment on an issue by saying, I'm not an expert, but? How many times are women interrupted, spoken over, or spoken for? We must recognize that the ubiquitous ways patriarchy has socialized women to shrink themselves, physically and intellectually, extend also into language, into what we can and cannot say. It is not just a fight for airtime. It is not just a policing of women's egos. It polices women's very language. And at the heart of that policing, standing guard over our language like a baton ready to strike, is a concept that seems deceptively simple: civility. When Donald Trump was elected, many truths that white Americans were oblivious to, willingly or naively, were forced onto their consciousness. It was impossible to deny that racism was a driving force behind his election, and yet analysts and pundits insisted it was the suffering working class, read white working class, and economic anxiety, as if people of color who were working class were immune from suffering or economic anxiety. Many white Americans exclaimed, "This is not the America I know," precisely because they had refused to or had never had to come face to face with that racism, and Trump's shameless expression of racism and bigotry finally forced some of them to see that America. Those of us who are not white and who have experienced that racism all too well have long known that America. Denial and gaslighting, the latter a form of psychological abuse that aims to make someone doubt their own thoughts, beliefs, and perceptions, went on full throttle as talking heads, politicians, media, and others went out of their way to blame everything but racism for Trump's success at the polls. For the sake of unity, free speech, and healing, civility was held up as paramount. The obsession with civility, no matter what, was at times bipartisan, as when both Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi, a Democrat, and Congressman Steve Scalise, a Republican, both of whom are white, criticized Maxine Waters, a Black Democratic Congresswoman, for encouraging her supporters to protest Trump administration officials in public whenever they saw them. But paramount to whom? Who does civility serve? Racism is not civil. Racism is not polite. And yet here were all those people lined up to insist that we be civil when talking about Trump and his supporters. Those who insist on civility in the face of its very opposite are those least affected by the incivility that Trump represents. They have more power and privilege than most of us. It's often easier to point out the incivility of racism than it is to point out the incivility of patriarchy. But just as civility is a luxury that only those unaffected by the bold racism of the Trump era can afford, I believe civility is similarly a luxury afforded by those unaffected by patriarchy. I will not be civil to anything or anyone that refuses to acknowledge the full humanity of women, girls, and gender-diverse people. This is a battle. To that end, the shock and the offense profanity causes are necessary and important. I think I have your attention now. Good evening, everyone. I would like to thank the Chicago Council for inviting me back. I was here when they were called something else in 2015 with my first book, Headscarves and Hymens, Why the Middle East Needs a Sexual Revolution. And I'm very glad to be back for the 7 necessary sins for women and girls. And I love to begin with Fuck the Patriarchy, and especially this section from profanity. I read different sections depending on where I go. But I wanted this to be a jolt, because that is the goal of this book. I mentioned in the introduction to this book that this is a feminist manifesto that is not a roadmap to peace with patriarchy. This feminist manifesto that I wrote for feminist revolutionaries around the world is a Molotov cocktail to throw at the gut of patriarchy. And because one of the so-called sins, I call them sins, obviously they're not sins, but I call them sins because the attributes that I label each of the chapters in my book after are things that women, girls, and gender-diverse people are not supposed to want to do or to be. One of those sins is violence, and I will read briefly from that chapter later on. And it is intentionally jarring because, as I mentioned in the sections that I read, patriarchy is jarring, racism is jarring, and this is not the time for politeness, and this is not the time for civility, and this is not the time to dampen the justified rage of so many of us with calls for unity and let's talk and why are you so angry, Mona? I've always been angry, but I'm especially angry these days. It's actually a good coincidence, or it's very timely that I'm speaking to you today, because it's the beginning of what are known as the 16 days of activism against violence against women. Now, I have never been a fan of these days for. I'm not a fan of International Women's Day. I'm not a fan of Valentine's Day. I'm not a fan of any day, because every day is Valentine's Day. Every day is International Women's Day, and every day must be a day to end violence against women. The fact that we have this one day, and there were protests across the world yesterday to protest against violence against women, is an indication, is a reminder of why I wrote this book. In the United States, every day, at least 3 women are murdered by husbands, partners, or ex-partners. These are men. Every day, at least 3 women are murdered by men they are in a relationship with, or men they are trying to leave, or men they have left. Every day. In France, it's a woman every 2 days. In Australia, it's a woman every week. And I mention those statistics because my first book, Headscarves and Hymens, Why the Middle East Needs a Sexual Revolution, focused specifically on patriarchy in the Middle East and North Africa, which is where I'm from. I was born in Egypt. I lived for many years in Saudi Arabia. And I was obliged to write about patriarchy in that part of the world before I wrote about it anywhere else, because I'm from that part of the world, and because I wrote my first book right after what has become known as the Arab Spring. I don't like the phrase the Arab Spring because I don't think revolutions are seasons or colors or cakes or candy or anything. They're revolutions and uprisings that involved real risk, and many people lost their lives, and many people continue to lose their lives because of their fight and their demands to be free and to have dignity and to live in freedom and dignity. I wanted to ask with my first book, what happens when the revolution goes home? Are we fighting the patriarch at home as hard as we're fighting the patriarch in the presidential palace? That was the subject of my first book. And everywhere I went, I did my best to make the audiences I spoke to recognize that when I spoke about patriarchy, I was not just speaking about the shit over there, I was speaking about the shit over here. And notice that I'm intentionally profane, as I read from my chapter on profanity. I'm intentionally profane because patriarchy is not polite. And it is more offensive that we're not fighting the patriarch at home, and it's more offensive that there are at least 3 women killed in the United States every day by men they're involved with. That's more offensive than my standing at a podium saying fuck and shit. So with my first book, I wanted to remind people that it's not just shit over there where I come from, it's shit over here too. But it was increasingly difficult. I had a woman stand up in Texas, in Dallas, and I had this happen frequently, but it was especially rich when it happened in Texas. She stood up and she told me, oh, I love Egypt. Oh, I lived in Egypt during the revolution. Oh, FGM, FGM, which is terrible. What can I do to help women in Egypt? And I said to her, I'm very touched that you want to help women in Egypt, but why don't you want to help women right here in Texas, where you've gone from 40 clinics that provide abortion to 5, where you have what I call the Christian Brotherhood, who have more power than the Muslim Brotherhood back in Egypt have ever dreamed of having. And a woman sitting next to her got up and said to her, do you recognize that Texas is not just full of Christian fundamentalism and this Christian Brotherhood that Mona speaks of, but also extreme levels of militarism? And so she was telling her, why aren't you fighting women here? And I had this challenge everywhere I went. People kept wanting to come to Egypt and rescue us. And I kept telling them, we're rescuing ourselves. Why don't you rescue the women right here? And the answer obviously was because it's much easier to deal with other people's shit. It's very difficult to sit here and say, I, as an American woman, my rights are in dire danger because of the Trump administration. And not just because of Trump. Trump is the fruition of decades of policies by the Republican Party to diminish, to utterly destroy women's reproductive rights, as well as racism, as well as misogyny, as well as homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, every kind of bigotry you can imagine. And yet they kept wanting to come to Egypt to help Egyptian women. So when Trump was elected, I thought, okay, it's time to come back to the US and rescue white women. Because I moved back to Egypt after the revolution began in Egypt because I wanted to practice feminism on the ground, and I wanted to write headscarves and hymens in Egypt. I couldn't write headscarves and hymens from New York. I live in Harlem, a neighborhood I love, but I had to be in Cairo, the country, my hometown, so that I could write the book about the revolution coming home. I had to go home for the revolution, the feminist revolution for me to go home. And then Trump was elected, and I was like, okay, it's time to go back to my other home now, because it's time to talk to white women in the United States. The majority of white women voters in the United States voted for Trump, and this is not an aberration. The majority of white women voters have always voted for the Republican Party. Because the majority of white women voters understand that their race trumps their gender, because their proximity to the power of rich white men in this country makes them think that it will protect them from patriarchy. And this book is a reminder that nothing will protect you from patriarchy. In this book, I mentioned that it's not just the white women in the United States, but according to a study that was conducted by a think tank in Germany, in at least 7 countries across Europe, white women are outnumbering the number of white men in electing right-wing, fascist, populist parties. What the fuck is going on? I ask in my book. Why are white women electing parties whose platforms are fundamentally against their rights? You have to read my book so that you can find out. But I bring this up to emphasize the urgency of the book I wrote, because this is a book that I wrote not just for the United States. I wrote this as a book for feminist revolutionaries across the world. And I'll read a bit about why I did that before. I'm going to read and speak and read and speak. I have written this book for a global audience of feminist revolutionaries. The United States is not the center of the feminist universe, but the US behaves like it's the center of all universes, and the world pays it a lot of attention. And having lived in the United States since 2000, I have learned the denial that many white Americans succumb to when it comes to gender issues. Many white Americans will confidently tell you that it's shit over there for women, meaning anywhere but the US, but too often concentrating on Muslim-majority countries, and in the same breath, be thankful that you live over here. Such denial only serves to strengthen patriarchy and to hurt those most affected by patriarchy and the myriad oppressions it allies with: women of color, working class and poor women, disabled women, and queer and trans women. There is an unjustified overconfidence among white American women, especially about the achievements of feminism and what it shielded them from. Few women around the world share the delusions of white American women about the achievements of feminism. Such overconfidence is one of the reasons that white American women finally began to be angry after Trump was elected. Where have they been? The fact that it took Trump to finally ignite white women's rage, and not the decades of misogyny, racism, bigotry, and other forms of discrimination that led to it, is a reminder of how privileged and sheltered white American women have been from the injustices that ignite rage in black women and girls and other women of color, and for which they're punished and stereotyped. Those white women have allowed their race to trump their gender, believing that their docility, compliance, and allegiance to white supremacy will protect them from the ravages of patriarchy that the rest of us experience. They are what I call foot soldiers of the patriarchy. White women have the most privilege of expressing anger and are the last to express it because they're sheltered from so much that ignites anger in the rest of us. Then, when white women finally find their anger, it's considered a revolution, when in reality, they're finally catching up to the revolution of rage that swept up the rest of us. Now, the first sin that I write about in the book is that rage, is anger, and that's from the chapter on anger. But anger is not enough. There have been so many books that have come out recently about anger, and anger is very important. I quote the black lesbian poet and intellectual and activist Audre Lorde, who said that anger is like the fuel that drives the engine of change. It's the beginning, but it can't be the end, because anger, just for the sake of anger, is going to destroy that engine. But it has to be the beginning, because whenever I talk about anger and the importance of nurturing anger in girls, so many people remind me, and I know, but the fact that they have to remind me is very telling. They tell me that girls are born with anger. And I know that. Girls are born with anger, and if you see any 2-year-old girl or 3-year-old girl or 4-year-old girl, you will see that anger. And I mentioned the anger that I had as a child in an anecdote in the chapter on anger when I say that the first time I ever had a man expose himself to me was when I was 4 years old. I was on a balcony speaking to a friend of mine across the street, and a man pulled up in a car, pulled out his penis, and beckoned for us to come downstairs. 2 4-year-old girls. At the time, I was so angry that I was standing on a little stool because I was so short I couldn't see above the railing of the balcony, that I picked up the slipper I was wearing and I waved it at this man because I fully believed that my anger would scare him. This tiny 4-year-old girl fully believed in her righteous anger against this man who was sexually assaulting her with his exhibitionism. He wasn't scared, of course, but I was very proud of my anger. So that was me at 4. But I quote in that chapter on anger a study called the Global Adolescent Survey that was conducted by sociologists around the world. The United States, Vietnam, China, Egypt, Ghana, countries in the global north, countries in the global south, so every faith background and every culture, progressive, conservative that you can imagine. And they studied boys and girls from the age of 6 to, I think, 16. And they found by the time girls reach the age of 10, they believe that they are weak and vulnerable. What happens to the girl who was 4 years old and fully believed that if she waved her slipper, she could terrify this sexual predator? What happens to her from the age of 4 that makes her at the age of 10 believe that she is weak and vulnerable? What happens, obviously, is patriarchy, which is why I want you to throw this book like a Molotov cocktail into its gut. Because it's not just our families, it's the media, it's the way we educate boys and girls, it's culture, it's religion, it's politics, it's the air we breathe. I describe patriarchy in various ways in the book, but one of the ways that I describe patriarchy is, especially for men, because many men will say to me, "What is this patriarchy of which you speak?" And I remind them that it's like asking a fish about water. And a fish will say, "What's water?" Because it's everything and nothing. A fish doesn't stop to think about water. A fish is going by its way. And that's what patriarchy is, especially for men. But patriarchy is not men. Patriarchy is the privileged systems and institutions of oppression that privilege male dominance. And the other way that I like to describe patriarchy is as an octopus. The head of that octopus is patriarchy. But it's not just about misogyny. It's just about misogyny, for example, in a country like the United States, where white women suddenly paid attention to what Donald Trump was doing after that Access Hollywood tape came out, because then he was saying, when you're famous, they let you grab them by the pussy. And then white women, whose only experience of patriarchy usually is misogyny, paid attention. But it's about more than misogyny. And that's why I liken it to an octopus. Because each one of those tentacles of the octopus is one of those oppressions that I say are the systems of oppression that work in tandem to privilege male dominance. So patriarchy is not men. And I emphasize this because I often remind men, I try my best not to focus men, because honestly, I don't give a fuck about men. My focus is women, girls, and gender diverse people. But I want to remind men that they too are hurt by patriarchy. Those tentacles of the octopus hurt them too. Because unless they're rich, unless they're white, in this country, unless they're Christian evangelical mostly, unless they're able-bodied, unless they're heterosexual, unless they're a particular kind of man, they will be hurt by that octopus. And that's why we say as feminists, feminism is good for everybody. Octopuses, I recognize, are very intelligent, beautiful creatures, but we must kill that octopus. So that's what happens to girls between the age of 4 to 10. And I begin the book with something that happened to me when I was 15. That is a reminder to myself, and that made me ask what happened to me. I wrote this book with enough rage to fuel a rocket. I knew I had to write it while I was still high on the glory of beating up a man who had sexually assaulted me. Who was this woman I had become? who looks men in the eye, seizing their gaze with my fury until they realize they should not fuck with me. I wanted to figure her out. For years, I had been shedding shame and gaining fury. For years, I had been thumping away at patriarchy like a piñata, hanging tantalizingly just out of reach. It was stubborn, but my tenacity and ferocity became my ladder. This book is my instruction manual for smashing that piñata. Once upon a time in 1982, I was a 15-year-old girl sexually assaulted twice at Islam's holiest site in Mecca, Saudi Arabia, as I performed Hajj, the Muslim pilgrimage that is the fifth pillar of Islam. I had never been sexually assaulted before, and I froze and burst into tears. I was ashamed and traumatized, and most crucially, I was silent. It took me years before I could tell anyone what had happened when I was on my first Hajj. I didn't know of the writer and poet Audre Lorde's work when I was assaulted, but as my feminism grew, I began to understand what she meant when she said, "Your silence will not protect you," and so I began to speak. And so there I was at my computer in February 2018, sharing once again that I'd been sexually assaulted twice during pilgrimage in 1982 to support Sabika Khan, a Pakistani woman who had shared on Facebook her own assault in Mecca. I asked fellow Muslim women who felt safe enough to share their own experience of sexual harassment or assault, either while performing Hajj or in a Muslim sacred space. I added a hashtag to my post, #MosqueMeToo. Over 2 days, my Twitter thread was retweeted and liked thousands of times. It was shared in Indonesian, Arabic, Turkish, French, German, Spanish, and Farsi. I had never before seen such a response. At first, men demanded, "Why didn't you make more of a fuss?" Soon after, men went into full gaslighting mode, anything to persuade me I had not experienced what I had experienced, or else questioning my character as a way to undermine my story. I could write a whole other book called Things You Will Hear When You Say You Have Been Sexually Assaulted. Observe. You are too ugly to be sexually assaulted. You're being paid to say this. You just want to be famous. You just want attention. You want to destroy Islam. You want to make Muslim men look bad. You are a whore. You imagined it, it was crowded. Why didn't you report it? You waited all that time. Why? What do you expect? Sexual assault happens everywhere. Why aren't you talking about sexual assault in New Zealand? You should have yelled and made a fuss. For 5 days, women from around the world had shared with me their most harrowing experiences of sexual harassment and assault at pilgrimage or other sacred spaces. Reading their stories undid something that had broken in me as that young pilgrim in 1982 that I thought I had stitched together. I had not fully grasped the magnitude of being sexually assaulted at the site towards which Muslims pray 5 times a day. The experience of telling stories, and especially men's refusal to believe them, was as if I was standing in pouring rain. I could feel it drenching every part of me, only to hear the weather forecast on television confidently explaining that it was sunny and dry with not a drop of rain expected. How could all of that have happened to me? How have I absorbed it, been forced to accept it so that I could go on every day? And how had I learned to get on with my life? For one night, I wanted some respite from that reckoning, so 5 days after I launched #MosqueMeToo, my beloved and I went to a club in Montreal to dance it off, to revel in the sensual delight of moving my body to music. And there, in the middle of a crowded and sweaty dance floor at age 50, I felt a hand on my ass. I had exactly 2 thoughts. You've got to be fucking kidding me. And this is still happening? I remembered my 15-year-old self at Hajj covered from head to toe with just my face and hands showing. Now, on that dance floor in Montreal, I was wearing a tank top and jeans. It did not matter, hijab or tank top, a man's hands still found me. And I was done. But unlike in 1982, when I could not turn around to find my assaulter, I immediately spotted my creep who had started to walk away. As if on autopilot, I followed him and tugged so hard at the back of his shirt that he stumbled. When he fell, I sat on top of him and I punched and I punched and I punched. Once was not enough. And each time I punched him, I yelled, "Don't you ever touch a woman like that again." While I was punching the man who had assaulted me, I could see from my peripheral vision my beloved talking to two men who had been dancing when I started beating the man and who were now preparing to pull me off my assaulter. My beloved later told me the two men had wanted to stop me from punching the man who had groped me. No, he assaulted her, he told the two men. Let's call them the chorus for patriarchy. She's got this, he said. It had been a long time since I experienced as much clarity as I did in those moments. I knew exactly what I was doing, defending myself, and exactly why I was doing it. I was done with men who gave themselves the right to do as they wished with my body. If at that most secret of temples, the holiest site of my religion, I am not safe from predatory hands, where am I safe? If at that most secular of temples, a dance club, predatory men also insist on assaulting us, where are we safe? My beloved and I went to the bar to get some water. A man who appeared to be from club management approached us and asked me to tell him what had happened. After I explained that I had beaten a man who had sexually assaulted me, he looked at my beloved and asked me, "Why didn't you let your husband take care of it?" So of course I explained to him, first of all, he's not my husband, and second of all, this is my body, I take care of it. And then third of all, I started another hashtag, because I live on Twitter, and I started hashtag I beat my assaulter. Much like hashtag #MosqueMeToo, it too went viral, and women from across the world, and I include some of the examples, shared their own experiences of beating their assaulter. Now, unlike when I started hashtag #MosqueMeToo, and a whole chorus of men wrote to me and said, "Why didn't you make more of a fuss?" I was 15, I froze, I burst into tears, which is a very normal reaction to sexual assault, but they insisted, "You should have done something." Here I am at the age of 50, and I did something, and guess what they said to me? "Don't you think you overreacted? Don't you think you went too far? What if the tables were reversed, as if I would go into a bar and grope a man?" And it was exactly that scenario and exactly that kind of language that got me into trouble in Australia recently, because my tour has taken me all over the place, and the most recent global part of the tour was in Australia. And I was invited to speak on a live TV show there called Q&A on their public broadcaster, the ABC. And that show has members of the audience stand up and ask questions, and I was on a panel. Now, this show was to coincide with a feminist festival called Broadside at a centre there called the Wheeler Centre. The festival was at Melbourne Town Hall. So this was the feminist edition of Q&A. And it was 5 women and 1 non-binary person who was also Indigenous. 3 of us were people of color. 2 of the women were women of color, and the non-binary person, as I said, was an Indigenous person. And tellingly, there was not a single man on the panel, but most tellingly, there were no white men on the panel. And I mention this because it's the chorus of white patriarchy that created the massive backlash that I will relay to you in a minute. So one of the questions that I got was about violence, about my beating up that man, and about why I have a chapter in this book in which I asked on Q&A, how many rapists must we kill before men stop raping women? How many? And I begin the chapter with an even more disturbing imaginary scenario. This is a question. I'm not encouraging people to go out there and kill men. This is a question. How many men must we kill every week? 100? 200? 1,000? 1,000,000? Not just until men stop raping women, but until patriarchy sends a representative to sit down with us and negotiate the dismantling of patriarchy. I got into a lot of trouble with my editor and copy editor when I wrote this in the book. And they asked me to rethink it many times over, and I insisted that this language stay. And I insist that that language stay because usually the question is, and again, you're going to hear this question now that it's 16 days of activism and it's the day to end violence against women. The question is usually, how many women must die before something happens? I'm done. This is 2019. How long are we going to ask that question? For how long? How many men must we kill until patriarchy is dismantled? When I ask that question, I'm accused of inciting violence. When I ask that question, I'm reminded that violence begets violence. I answer that by the question, what has the violence of men against women and gender diverse people begotten? How many rapists must we kill before men stop raping women? It sounds barbaric, especially when I say, must we kill 1 million? But across the world, there are wars happening today, and across history, wars have happened. These are wars that were begun by men against other men, and for which millions of men were killed, and millions of men killed other men. That is rarely framed as the barbarism that I'm accused of. And yet, when I ask people to imagine this intentionally disturbing scenario, more people are outraged at my question, at this imaginary violence against men, than they are outraged at the actual daily violence that men subject women to across the world. This is a legitimate question that we all must ask. When I asked this question on that episode of Q&A, and also the fact that, because you know now, because I read for you from the chapter on profanity, I am intentionally profane, I said fuck on this TV show 10 times. They counted it. I said fuck 10 times. 200 white men complained to the network and to their television commissioner, and the show was banned. The show was banned in Australia, an ostensible democracy. Their Minister for Communications, the Minister for Communications in Australia, not Saudi Arabia, not Egypt, the Minister for Communications in Australia issued a statement, and there's going to be a parliamentary inquiry. Because I asked, how many rapists must we kill before men stop raping women? Absorb the magnitude of that. Where is the parliamentary inquiry on the rape of women? Where is the parliamentary inquiry on the fact that one woman at least is killed every week in Australia by her husband, by her partner, or by her ex-partner, all men? And that's why I insisted on having this chapter on violence in this book. I mentioned the profanity, and before I move on to the last reading that I want to share with you, because we're going to open up, how many minutes do I have? Thank you. Before I wrap it up and then we open the Q&A, I would be remiss if I did not mention a feminist hero of mine who forces all of these really difficult and necessary questions, and in the most beautifully profane way. And that is the feminist scholar and activist Dr. Stella Nyanzi, who is Ugandan and who is currently in prison in Uganda because she offended the dictator of her country, who has been in power for at least 34 years. This is a professor in a university in Uganda. She is a feminist. She posted a poem on her Facebook page on the occasion of the official birthday of Yoweri Museveni, who is the dictator of her country, in which she wishes that his mother's birth canal had poisoned him at birth. And then she writes at the bottom of the poem, "This is my address, Yoweri. Come and beat me up if you wish." Just the year before, she had been arrested and she was detained for 5 weeks and then released, and the authorities at the time decided not to put her on trial because she had called Museveni a pair of buttocks. And she had done so because he had reneged on a promise to end period poverty in Uganda. He had promised, as one of his election promises, that the government in Uganda would provide girls across the country with sanitary napkins and sanitary products, because alarmingly high rates of girls in Uganda have to pull out from school or do not attend at all because pads and tampons are very expensive in their countries. And when he reneged on this, Stella Nyanzi took to social media and called him a pair of buttocks and criticized him and his wife, the First Lady, Janet Museveni. And for that, she was sent to prison. She was jailed. She was detained for 5 weeks. But just as importantly, she launched a campaign. She too likes Twitter and she too likes hashtags. And she launched the campaign, #PadsForUganda, that managed to collect within the space of weeks 1 million sanitary napkins for girls in the country. So she was showing Museveni that she, this lone feminist activist professor, could do what he, who had so much wealth, refused to do. And when she came out of prison, she was interviewed. And in one of the interviews, she said, Museveni has all the guns, he has all the tanks, he has all the grenades, he has all the bullets, and he has all the wealth, and all I have is my language. And that's why I, Mona, say fuck, to honor Stella Nyanzi. But Stella Nyanzi herself is a proponent of something that her country has long understood, and that is the concept of radical rudeness. And it's a concept that I wish we would all embrace, especially in the United States, as we have concentration camps on the border where children are stolen from their families and people are kept in inhumane conditions, especially as women's rights are being destroyed, especially as Islamophobia and anti-Semitism and all forms of bigotry, and especially as transphobia and homophobia endanger so many lives. And radical rudeness is the political use of profanity against authority. And radical rudeness began in Uganda during British colonization of that country, when you had Christian Victorians who went out there, these white men who went to Uganda to quote unquote civilize it. What is more uncivil? What is more savage than colonization? And they went to Uganda to civilize it and to teach them decorum. What is more indecorous? What is more harmful and damaging? Colonization or teaching people to be polite to authority? And so to stand up to those colonizers, anti-colonial activists in Uganda began to intentionally and politically use profanity and rudeness. And that's where the concept radical rudeness comes from. And that's what Stella Nyanzi is a proponent of. And that's why I honor her. And that's why I'm intentionally profane. Because radically profane times require those of us who can to be radically profane in whatever way we can in return. And it's my ambition, as part of that profanity, to defy, disobey, and disrupt the patriarchy at every turn. And talking about ambition, I want to share a bit from my chapter on ambition with you before I open it up to questions. Who or what determines what women are supposed to be, want, and do? Primarily, of course, patriarchy. Always patriarchy. But patriarchy works in tandem with other forms of oppression. That's especially the case for women of color and women from marginalized groups. Working in tandem, patriarchy, racism, and capitalism delineate where women should be. Those three constructs squeeze women into being less than. They work so seamlessly together that ambition is rarely seen outside the borders of those constructs. A popular portrayal of ambition presumes one's goal is to become a CEO, to have a corner office, or to become rich. It is by and large written about and for the middle and upper middle class white woman's experience. The tenacious ethos of having it all never seems to disappear. What is all? How freely can women choose from among the various things that comprise that all? Work, family, both, none? Surely such freedom depends on where you were born, to what privilege, and how complicated is the Venn diagram of oppressions that color your life. What is ambition liberated from all of that? What is ambition when you're a woman of color? What is ambition for a woman whose goal is not to become a CEO? What does ambition look like for a woman whose goal is not to become rich? What is ambition liberated from corporate success? What is ambition for a woman who's poor? Answers for all of those questions invariably lead to more questions. What is work? What is the definition of success? And those questions in turn lead to the options or choices that women are told are theirs. Where along the atlas of options does the shoreline of work begin and the landmass of family end? It's impossible to answer those questions without recognizing the impact of patriarchy, racism, and classism on the lives of so many women. What is ambition liberated from all of those oppressions? Ambition is defiance. It's a middle finger to patriarchy's insistence that we shrink ourselves. Attention and ambition are cousins. Attention is also a sin. The former, attention, defies patriarchy through the belief that I deserve attention, and the latter by declaring I am more than. A similar arrogance fuels both attention and ambition. I'm a big fan of female arrogance. The who do you think you are that punishes the sin of attention also pushes back against the sin of ambition. Who do I think I am? Someone who I believe is more than what she is told she could be. I believe I am one of the most important feminists in the world today, and that is why I wrote the book you are reading. It has been my ambition to be an author who is read around the world and whose work is influential and a source of power for women especially. It's my ambition to be known for work that defies, disobeys, and disrupts patriarchy. It's my ambition to be a radical and relevant voice against patriarchy, racism, classism, homophobia, transphobia, and all forms of bigotry. And I believe I am succeeding. That is who I think I am. Am I arrogant in believing this? Who cares? I have fucking earned it. And to close, thank you. Clap in a minute to close. Okay, it's also very timely that I'm speaking to you today because exactly 8 years ago today, I was released from hospital with both my arms in a cast because exactly 8 years ago yesterday, during a protest very close to Tahrir Square, a protest against the police and military in Egypt, my friend and I made it to the front line of the protest and we were entrapped by plainclothes security who held on to us until Egyptian riot police came. And I was surrounded by 4 riot police who beat me. They broke my left arm, they broke my right hand, they sexually assaulted me, and their supervising officer threatened to gang rape me. I was taken to the Interior Ministry and held incommunicado for 6 hours. And then I was taken to military intelligence, at the time headed by Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who was the current dictator of my country. I call him the current fascist fuck of Egypt, who is supported by the current fascist fuck of the United States. I told you I was profane. And I was held by military intelligence for another 6 hours, during which I was blindfolded and interrogated with both my arms broken. I even asked them, is this really necessary? My arms are broken. And when I was finally released, I went to the ER and found, to my alarm, that both arms had to be in a cast for 3 months. So today is the day that I celebrate my freedom, that I celebrate my survival, that I celebrate my defiance, that I also celebrate my privilege because of who I am free and I am alive. Had I been a working class Egyptian woman who is anonymous, who is not known, who is not famous, who does not write books, who does not have the privilege of standing on stage here to address you in Chicago or on a TV show in Australia, I most likely would have been gang raped or killed in Egypt. So I am very privileged. And because of that, I write Molotov cocktails to destroy patriarchy, the octopus, not just misogyny. And because of that, I will always defy, disobey, and disrupt patriarchy, because so many other women want to, and none of them is voiceless. I do not speak for the voiceless. No one is voiceless. Everyone has a voice. If you do not hear their voice, ask why. What is silencing them, and why don't you hear them? And because of that, I'm going to end my talk to honor my freedom and my survival, and to celebrate it with this last passage from the chapter on ambition. Until we divorce patriarchy from ambition and ambition from patriarchy, we will forever force women and girls to shrink their ambition to fit that asinine phrase, women can do whatever men can. I do not want to do anything a man can. I want to be free. Feminism is not equality. Feminism is the destruction of patriarchy, because I do not want to be equal to someone who is not free, and men are not free. I want to be free. Here is how we pass the baton of ambition from woman to girl. When one of my nieces was 8 years old, she told me she had been looking up pictures of our family online. I saw one of you. She paused. Never mind. I thought she had wanted to say she had seen a picture of me with my arms in casts after Egyptian riot police assaulted me, and that she had paused mid-sentence because she was worried she would upset me with a bad memory. After a bit of cajoling by her mother, she finally told me that she meant she'd seen a picture of me getting arrested in a Times Square subway station in New York City after I spray painted over a racist ad in 2012. My darling niece thought that I would be upset she'd seen a picture of me getting arrested for doing something I had vowed to do. I was proud of my civil disobedience, for which I was jailed overnight and charged with criminal mischief, making graffiti, and possession of a graffiti instrument. These are real charges. A judge eventually dropped the charges in the interest of justice. I told my niece that I was proud of getting arrested. We had a good chat about why I spray painted over the ad and why protesting was important. And then, together, we looked at the pictures of me getting arrested. And our conversation continued. Niece, I know why you got tattoos, pointing to my forearms. Why? I asked. Because they broke those arms and you wanted to say, I'm free and awesome. Why did they break your arms? They wanted to scare me and make me go home and stop protesting. Did you go home? No. Good. Let us always tell girls they can be more than, and let us always tell girls, fuck the patriarchy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mona. We're going to open the floor to questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll have a mic runner come to you, and kindly make your question a question rather than a comment so we can take as many as possible. Thank you. Any, right up here? Could we get a mic up here? Thanks.
Hi, my name is Brianna Garrett. I'm a student at Northwestern's Medill School of Journalism. And you had mentioned earlier the story of how the majority of white women voters had been invested in this sort of fairy tale you were saying of the status quo. And then you also asked us to think how many men would it take, how many men would we have to kill to disrupt and interrupt patriarchy. So I ask you, just how much anger does it take to divest from patriarchy as a woman?
Yes, thank you for that question. I think that for many women, it ends up becoming something really personal, that something had to have happened to them personally so that they can recognize just how harmful patriarchy is. And I think, and it's actually like generally with the revolution, like, in Egypt, there were many people who didn't become involved in protests unless they themselves had been beaten up by the police, or they had a relative who had been disappeared by the police. The challenge then becomes, are you able to understand that this is something that harms all of us, even if your current kind of island of privilege protects you from it? And I think this is where it becomes, and this is why we often criticize liberal feminism or white feminism, because it becomes a question of individual gain. I don't want a kind of feminism that is, that's why I said ambition for me isn't to become rich. I've never been rich. Ambition for me isn't just so that I can be protected from patriarchy and I don't care about anyone else. So we have to find a way in which to emphasize to everybody that patriarchy harms everybody, even if you yourself are doing well. I mean, right now, look, I'm traveling the world by myself. I mean, like, fuck you, patriarchy, I'm free, I can just, go and lie on a beach somewhere. I wish I could, but I'm so fucking enraged at everything right now. I can't. I dream of this stuff, So I think this is what we have to do. We have to make it so important and make people understand that it will get you eventually, even if you're not poor, even if you're not a woman of color, even if you're not, further down that hierarchy. So the challenge becomes to go to the most privileged people and to say to them, your privilege will not protect you, or as Audre Lorde said, your silence will not protect you. How much anger does that require? Sometimes it's the anger of personal grievance against something, but then that takes you into that individualistic, very selfish kind of liberal white feminism, and that is a feminism I reject, which is why I've said I wrote this book for feminist revolutionaries who recognize that that kind of feminism is not the center of the world, because that kind of feminism failed. Now, my black activist friends will say that that feminism has succeeded just fine for white women because they're doing just fine by and large. But again, it's a specific kind of white woman who's doing just fine. White women in Texas who don't have access to reproductive rights are not doing just fine. So who is doing just fine? The woman who obeys, the woman who is rich, the woman who, okay, until a certain point, and then she crosses that point and it's like, oh, patriarchy, hello, welcome to the rest of us.
Thank you.
I travel the world in putting that fire in people's belly, regardless of how much privilege they have.
Are there any other questions? Right over here.
Thank you so much again for speaking tonight. My question is, I work in finance and I work in local government, and there's just men everywhere. So what advice would you give to this type of a profession where my day-to-day is with other men and they just don't believe anything that has been discussed today?
Yeah, because the men are the fish. When you talk to them about water, they're like, what is this water business? First of all, good luck. It's really difficult in professions and in circumstances and in places that have always been designed for men, by men, about men, in which they never envisioned any of us showing up and basically ruining it for the rest of them. And it's not just finance. I mean, it's a friend of mine recently went to the UK so that she could be there for the I don't know what the word would be, but it's the first black woman bishop of the Anglican Church in England, in the UK. Now, this is a unique position for her, of course, and it's making history, but I can only imagine the kind of hurdles that she's going to experience. It's the same kind of hurdles when women wanted to enter the military, the armed forces. It's also what happened when women wanted to enter politics. So basically what I'm saying is, all of these institutions, all of these places were never designed for us in mind. They were all designed, and depending on, I'm going to talk about the US now, obviously in other countries, in white majority countries, it's not about white men. But in the US, they were designed by white men and for white men. And then, like I said, the rest of us showed up and ruined it. So I would suggest that if you have any men there who even have like a basic understanding of just how fucking unjust it all is, just try to form some kind of network with them. The few women that are there, encourage them to understand that what happens in situations like that is that patriarchy throws us crumbs and makes us fight for those crumbs because of the scarcity syndrome scenario where it tries to pit us against each other so that there can only be one or two women where there shouldn't be one or two women. Refuse to fight each other, refuse the crumbs. I keep saying I don't want your fucking crumbs, I want the whole cake. I actually don't want your cake, I want my own cake. But you and the other, like, find your allies and make your own cake. And just take the fight to them. I always tell people, find a way to defy, disobey, and disrupt every day, no matter how small. Because I say that this defy, disobey, disrupt is like, I liken it to weightlifting, where when you first start lifting weights, you start with the lightest weights and then you build up. And it becomes this exercise that helps your muscles develop. Develop your feminist muscles in whatever scenario you're in by every day finding a way to defy, disobey, and disrupt, no matter how small. And it just strengthens you along the way until you make them so uncomfortable that they will actually have to listen to you.
There's a follow-up question to that online. I look like I'm part of the patriarchy, but I emphatically do not associate with it. What specific things can I do both in my daily life and my political activism to accomplish that end?
I always get that question, and I always say it is not my job to tell you how to dismantle the patriarchy, because Audre Lorde said over and over, and she was absolutely right, of course, because she was always right, Men are always asking women why misogyny is bad. White people are always asking people of color why racism is bad and how they can fight it. Straight people are always asking queer people why homophobia is bad and how to fight it. It's not my job to both survive and fight and then also tell you who benefit from it. But this is what I will say. It's their job to go and talk to others who are invested in the patriarchy, who look like them, regardless of how they look like, and go and talk to them, not talk to me. Because if they're saying that they're on my side, they should go to the people who are not on my side and take the fight to them and leave me with my own fighting.
Great, thank you. Any other questions for the floor? Over there.
Thank you so much for sharing. So we defy, we disrupt, we break down, and then what's next? For women, once we get inroads, how do we build on the inwards roads that we've gained? What's next for us?
Okay, I'm so glad that you believe that this is going to happen because so many people say this is impossible. Thank you. Thank you for your belief in feminism. What's next is to dismantle all of these injustices. What's next is to imagine something we have never been allowed to imagine. The fact that we have to ask what's next is a symptom of the fact that our imaginations have been arrested and we have been prohibited from imagining any other world than this. It's like revolution again. Because you know, in Egypt, we were always asked when the revolution began, okay, so you want to end military rule? Well, who's the alternative? Okay, so you want to end this dictatorship of 30 years of Hosni Mubarak? Well, what's next? And usually, and I'm not saying you're doing this, usually those questions are asked to basically make us accept the status quo so that we're forced to say, you know what? Oh my God, this is so fucking hard. Okay, let's just take baby steps because this is so unrealistic, it's never going to happen. So let's imagine the unimaginable. And let's say we are going to destroy you, patriarchy. And what's next is a world that is much better than the world we have today. What's next is a world where the majority of us who are harmed by the world that we live in today actually live freely, and the minority who are enjoying the benefits of this unjust world actually finally get to understand why equality is not enough, because the way that they described equality was crumbs, and that freedom is the way. Now, I'm speaking in all these like broad kind of utopian way, like phrases, and I'm not giving you concrete things because it doesn't matter. The concrete right now doesn't matter. What matters is that you free your imagination enough to get to the stage where you believe something better is possible. Because we are always, the first thing you're going to be asked is, well, what's the alternative? Well, what's next? And also, it's very similar to this question too. It is not my job to come around and explain what we now need. It is my job to destroy this. It is my job. I am that vanguard. I am the feminist warrior. I am patriarchy's worst nightmare. And I'm out there obliterating it with my Molotov cocktail. The rest of you in this room, this is a room full of very intelligent people. Work on what's next. There, I have employed all of these for you.
Thank you so much, Mona. And for all of you, we will have a book signing, and then I encourage you to join us over for cocktails and conversations at the St. Jane Hotel. Please join me in thanking Mona for her advocacy and strong work. Thank you.